Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar, Mapping Modern Mahāyāna Chinese Buddhism and Migration in the Age of Global Modernity. Before we begin, I would like to make a few reminders. We mute your microphone and turn off our videos to avoid unnecessary noise. Secondly, if you have questions, please click the question link in the chat box and write them down as they would be answered by the speaker during the Q&A section. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the In Remembrance of Master Xing Yun lecture series organized by the Center for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. This is the sixth lecture in the series entitled Mapping Modern Mahāyāna, Chinese Buddhism and Migration in the Age of Global Modernity. We are delighted to have invited Professor James Rick from the University of the West as our guest speaker today. I would like to introduce our host today, Professor Chen, the Director of the Center for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, who would introduce our speaker. Next, let's welcome Professor Chen to speak to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank our moderators. Good morning to our audience. You are welcome to join us again to listen to some academic ideas. And as we know, this lecture series is in remembrance of Venerable Master Xing Yun. Time goes by very quickly. 2.5 months ago, Master Xing Yun passed away on 5th of February. I think a great generation has come to an end, but we will carry on his legacy and final wishes, I think. continue to grow and soar, and pass on the precious ideas of Buddhism to everyone, everywhere, even from generation to generation. Today, we are honored to have Professor James Rank as our guest speakers. Professor Rank is assistant professor and assistant chair at the Religious Study Department and also director of the Institute for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism at University of the West. And in his research, he examined modern and contemporary Buddhism practiced by ethnic Chinese around the world. As we promote Chinese Buddhism, his research in this area is an important one. According to his research, colonialism, globalization, and the ethnic Chinese migration dynamics are all taken into account. So, example, his recent book, Mapping Modern Mahāyāna, Chinese Buddhism and the Migration in the Age of Global Modernity. This book presents a multi-site ethnography of Guangshan temples in Taiwan, Los Angeles, South Africa, and the People's Republic of China. So today we have the chance to let him to introduce his idea about his research and what kind of explore he has achieved. Now, please join me in welcoming our honored speaker, Professor James Rank, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Chen. And of course, thank you to the center for inviting me, to Professor Chen for making it happen, who is, of course, my Koshi Huiyuan from Taiwan many years ago when I did my master's at Zhengzhou University. We have a long history. And of course, also thank you to Fo Guangshan for making this talk happen, this lecture series possible. Be very honored to be invited to share my book. Let me share my screen. Okay, now should work. So as Professor Chen has introduced, the title of my book is Mapping Modern Mahāyāna, Chinese Buddhism and Migration in the Age of Global Modernity. It is published. Time passes really quickly. It's already 2 years, and now it's published at De Gruyter in the series Dialectics of the Global in 2021. So by now it's 2 years ago, but still relatively recent. So I'll give you a little overview about my talk today. So I will start with a little background, how the whole book came together. It was based on my PhD thesis. Then I will talk a little bit about the academic context, about those academic discussions the book is situated in, or the book is contributing to. And since we have 90 minutes, I've also taken some time to talk a little bit about the theoretical and methodological considerations, because I assume my audience today is very familiar, of course, with Fo Guangshan. So if I have a similar book talk here in America, I focus more on presenting the ethnographic data. But of course, in Hong Kong, in China, in Taiwan, people are very familiar, of course, with the important work of Fo Guangshan. So here I will focus more on the theoretical framework and the whole framing of the book. Nevertheless, the main part is, of course, the content of the book. And it's I will focus on 2 parts, which is the historical part and the ethnographic part. I will talk about those 2 disciplinary perspectives, so the combination of those 2 a little bit more in a moment. But let me turn on my timer so I keep the time. Yes, and then moving on to the conclusion. So here you can see, of course, see the title of the book. It's also here, it's not, it's very, because of the screen, it's impossible, but here on the, you can see the title. But let me talk a little bit about the background first. The book is based on my research as a PhD candidate at the University of Leipzig, where I was a student at the China Studies Sinology Department under Professor Philip Clark. However, at the same time, I was also a researcher. I was hired for a collaborative research center. And that is basically what made the whole book and the whole project possible, because it was very generous funding. And it also is responsible for the very specific globalization framework of the book, which is still somewhat unusual in research on Chinese religions and Chinese Buddhism. And so let me explain a little bit about this specific center, because I feel that's a very European thing, which is very different. Now I'm, of course, in the United States. Before I lived in Asia. And that's something specifically European, that there are state-funded research centers who are very big, who are temporary for like 4, 8, or 12 years, where people from many different disciplinary backgrounds come together and study one topic. So in the case of the center where I was working at, it was called Processes of Spatialization under the Global Condition. That's a very jargon, scientific, social science name. It basically means globalization studies. And the idea was to really take space as a research category into account and looking at all kinds of global phenomena through all kinds of disciplinary lenses. So that included, of course, history, political science, geography, anthropogeography, but also area studies. And in my case, that meant, of course, China studies. And most research projects were looking at economic, especially economic, but also political and cultural phenomena. And my project, together with my colleague, Nicolas Breuil, we were looking at religion, and especially Chinese religion. I had, of course, Foguanshan as a case study, while Dr. Breuil was focusing on a redemptive society. So my topic, or my question, was really looking at the transnational spread of Foguanshan. And before I go on, since it's especially social science have all these complicated sounding names, let me just explain a little bit what the meaning of transnational. Transnational is different from international in a sense that international refers to the relationship between governments of states, while transnational, trans is like connecting, cutting, refers to those movements of actors below the state level. That may be companies, that may be tourists, that may be migrants, and of course also, as in the case of my project, religious organizations or Buddhist organizations like Foguanshan. So the broad aim of this book, and that's also why I explained this part before, was really linked within this global studies framework. However, I tried to connect it with discussions in Buddhist studies. So the whole aim was of this book to really explore the conditions and dynamics that have facilitated Foguanshan's global development. Foguanshan is, of course, the most successful order on a Chinese Buddhist order on a global perspective. Of course, Tzu Chi may be similarly successful in terms of globalization. However, Tzu Chi is more a charity organization. In terms of a more comprehensive Buddhist order, Foguanshan is, of course, undoubtedly the most successful one. And there has been research on the issue before, but mainly on Foguanshan in Taiwan. And I wanted to look at it in a broader scale. And of course, when I was in the field, it's the Venerable Master Xing memorial lecture today. And of course, when I asked people, the main driving force for Foguanshan's success was, of course, Venerable Master Xing. But however, the existing research was also very focused already on Venerable Master Xing. I tried to explore and expand the research lens to some extent, which is why I wanted to consider the global conditions and dynamics. So I'm not going to talk a lot about Master Xing today. However, that does not mean, of course, that he is not of importance for this for Foguanshan's globalization project. Instead, he's of course the driving factor. And everyone, and it's a fieldwork based book. So I went into the field to different sites. I did interviews, participant observation. And whenever I asked people what brought them to Fo Guangshan in South Africa, in other places in the US, of course, the first answer was always Venerable Master Xing Yun. So let me speak a little bit more about the academic context of the book, or the contribution the book is aiming to make, or I'm aiming to make with my book. The first one is, it's trying to provide a fresh take on the research on modern Chinese religions, right? Most research on modern Chinese religions looks at those, especially in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China. Of course, now there's Dr. Shek Chia. There is, of course, now also work on Chinese religions in Singapore, and there's some work in Malaysia. And of course, in the Chinese language, there's much more work on Chinese religions in Asia. But in the English language, it's still very much focused on the core region in Asia. But of course, Chinese religions have been globalized, right? I mean, I'm in the US right now. I'm at University of the West, which is, of course, founded by Fo Guangshan and by Xilai Temple. Xilai Temple is here. So Chinese religions have long expanded over the whole globe. And there are some studies looking at specific sites, but so far there was no study really taking into account the whole global spread in itself. So that's why I try to really consider issues of transnationalism, but also of ethnic Chinese migration and the so-called emergence of the new migrant. A new Chinese migrant. And I will speak about that more in a minute. The second academic discussion the book is contributing to, and that is a discussion I'm going to talk less about today, is this looking at or understanding the social, cultural, and religious fabrics of globalization. As I said before, my research was linked to a research project that was funded by the DFG, German Research Organization Foundation, by the government, very, very generously. So of course, there was also one of the main goals was looking at globalization through the lens of a non-Western and religious actor. And this takes some place in my book. However, today, due to reasons of time, I will not talk about this aspect too much, but if you have questions, of course, we have a Q&A session at the end. I'm more than happy to talk about this aspect too. And then the third academic discussion I'm aiming to contribute to is, of course, modern Buddhism, our understanding of modern Buddhism. And you can see by the brackets already, there is a little S. So is there one modern Buddhism, or is there modern Buddhisms? Those of us who are familiar with Taiwan, with China, with Singapore, with Asia, be it because we lived there, we are origin from there, or in the fields of area studies, of course, looking at Fo Guangshan, with no doubt, it's a modern Buddhist order. And that was also, it's very often of Venerable Taixu, Venerable Inshun, Venerable Master Xing Yun. Those are, of course, representatives of the modernization of Chinese Buddhism. However, if we look in the literature on Buddhism in the West, very often we find this picture where European American Buddhism, meditation-focused Buddhism, is perceived or portrayed as a modern Buddhism, and then juxtaposed with Buddhism by Americans of Chinese or Asian origin, which is then portrayed as traditional Buddhism. So how can the same phenomena in one context perceived as traditional and in the other perceived as clearly a modern example of Buddhism? And that is one question I will also, a main question I will talk about in my book, and I will talk about more today. Let me give you some more methodological considerations. So what I try to do in my book, I'm a sinologist by training. However, my focus is a social scientific focus. And but what I try to avoid, I feel many books on Buddhism, which have a strong focus on social science, they really ignore the Buddhist content of the Buddhists, right? There's very much only in the here and now. Social science, of course, deals with the present. And I thought it's really important, if we want to understand Fo Guangshan's Buddhist reform project and humanistic Buddhism or Rinzai Buddhism, then we really have to apply a long durée framework, right? We have to start with the whole tumults and changes China went through after its encounter with European colonialism. Of course, the transition from dynastic China to Republican China. And only then we can really see clearly the modern disposition of modern Chinese Buddhism in comparison also in a global context when it encounters non-Chinese Buddhist modernities, modern religiosities. So again, space was an important research category given to us by the research center, so it was applied to every single project. And one question was, of course, how do we research mobile and border crossing phenomena, right? In the past, especially from an ethnographic perspective, in the past, let's say 100 years ago, at the beginning of an ethnography as a research method was developed. Of course, a European scholar would go to some indigenous society, another continent, stay there for 3 years, like excluded from the world around them, collect data, and then go back to the European metropole, write down their observations, and publish a book. Of course, with contemporary phenomena, that is not possible anymore, right? Our whole world is interconnected. There is no space that is untouched by the outside world. And especially mobile or border crossing phenomena like Foguangshan, but also like a company or like tourism, they happen at the same time at different places. So what Ulrich Beck, a famous German sociologist, said was we have to avoid using methodological nationalism. And what he means thereby is, so far, if researchers have looked at mobile and border crossing phenomena, they looked at them only within the context of one state. So for example, if they looked at migration, they would only look at foreigners in Germany, if it's a German scholar. If it's an American scholar, they would look at migrants in the US. And similar in Taiwan. So, but of course, if you want to understand phenomena like migration, like any other mobile phenomena that cross borders, we have to consider the place they're coming from, the places they're passing, and the places they're arriving. And in many cases, phenomena are continuing to be mobile. And then, of course, a very unlucky example would be COVID, right? If you want to understand the spread of COVID, we cannot look at only one country. We have to look at the whole world because COVID, of course, ignores national borders. And the same is true for most phenomena, right? For ideas, for economic phenomena, but also for human beings. And of course, also for religions. So the most common tool to counter this danger of methodological nationalism, as it's called, is to use multi-sited ethnography, which is a method developed by ethnographer George Marcus already in the 1990s. So instead of spending a lot of time at one space, it really means to follow one's phenomenon. And in the case of Foguangshan, that means to follow Foguangshan, right? Not spending all the time at the headquarters in Kaohsiung, because then we really only understand what happens in Kaohsiung. Also, not only spending all the time in Xilai Temple, because then we only understand what happens at Xilai Temple in the US. So we really have to try to follow and to go to different field sites. Of course, in the case of Foguangshan, it's impossible to go to all field sites, right? Foguangshan is present in almost 40 countries, has over 200 temples and practice sites, practice centers. So one would just travel to each of these centers. One would spend 2 or 3 or 4 years and spending like, I don't know, a week in each center. So one couldn't do any in-depth field work at any of those centers. So in my case, that meant I had to make a selection, pick a selection of field sites. And of course, every selection has its advantages, every selection has its disadvantages, right? I mean, you will never cover the whole field. That's the whole idea of a selection. So what I tried to do was find 3 temples. I spent first half a year in Taiwan at Benshan, or the Root Mountain, and Foguang University and Taipei, different places there. But then I picked three global overseas temples of Fo-Guang-Shan that seemed to me most or best reflecting the globalization project of Fo-Guang-Shan. And the first one was, of course, Xilai Temple. Xilai Temple is undoubtedly the Fo-Guang-Shan's overseas center, right? It was the first temple, the first big temple established overseas. It has, when Master Xing already came to the US in the 70s. Of course, the first Xilai Temple was not the Xilai Temple today. There were two smaller churches that were bought. The second one was called then Xilai Temple already, who were modeled into a temple. And then in the 80s, the actual Xilai Temple of today was established. And Xilai Temple is, of course, a very industrious, a very important overseas center for Fo-Guang-Shan. It's located at the center of the San Gabriel community. I will talk about that more in a moment, which is a huge suburban area right outside of LA City, which has a huge overseas Chinese population. The temple has many, many activities. So in the case of Xilai Temple, it was impossible for me during my field stay to attend every activity that took place at the time, because there were always several activities taking place at the same time. It's a really busy temple, especially before the pandemic, of course. And when I was in the US, I would spend 9 weeks in every region after having spent half a year in Taiwan. So the 9 weeks in the US, of course, I would make trips to San Diego, Fo-Guang-Shan there, to Las Vegas, and to smaller temples in the Southern California and this region of the United States. However, of course, if you look at Xilai Temple, it's also a very affluent temple, right? It even has a university here, supports the university here, or runs the University of the West. But of course, we also, to have a balanced picture, I also had to consider a fieldwork example that was less affluent, and in a region that is less of a center of ethnic Chinese migration. So that was one of the reasons why I picked Nanhua Temple. Nanhua Temple is, as Xilai Temple, a regional headquarters. It's located in South Africa. It was built roughly 10 years later than Xilai Temple. Of course, in South Africa, the real estate prices are significantly lower than Los Angeles. So the land is actually much bigger. It's a very impressive structure, a very beautiful structure. Also, Xilai Temple, Nanhua Temple runs 2 schools, has certain, as Xilai Temple has restaurants and all kind of places for people to interact with. But of course, Nanhua Temple, or South Africa as a space or as a destination of migration, is significantly less popular than Los Angeles, right? And especially, it was quite popular during the 80s, 90s for historical reasons. The government in Taiwan, the government in South Africa at the time had cooperations. People, Taiwanese, went for investments. But of course, today, the situation has somewhat changed. There is a relatively small Taiwanese diaspora. The ethnic Chinese, the Chinese diaspora, and its whole is growing. So there's many Chinese from the mainland, especially from areas like Hangzhou, but also Fujian. But overall, those came significantly later, right, after the 2000s, and so we can really see the temple has a very different support structures compared than Xilai Temple. Of course, when I was at Nanhua Temple, I would always do regular visits to other units, Fo-Guang-Shan temples, or BLIA units, which in Johannesburg and Pretoria in specific. And finally, I mean, those temples were very, very important to kind of, one is in the global south, one is in the global north. But of course, they were both founded in the 80s, 90s. I did my research starting in 2016. And by then, of course, Fo-Guang-Shan was already heavily invested in mainland China, had renovated the ancestral Venerable Master Xing's ancestral temple, Dajue Temple in Yixing, and of course runs also several other facilities like a library or a vegetarian restaurant, a water drop restaurant, several cultural centers, and so on. So I also wanted to reflect this newest addition to Foguangshan's globalization movement. And of course, there's always other, picking, as I said, picking three means not picking many others. So of course, for example, I would have really liked to also pay more attention to the case of Malaysia, because Malaysia is a very important, Malaysia, Singapore, but especially Malaysia, it's a very important space for Foguangshan, similar to the US, or for ethnic Chinese migration, but also for the development of Foguangshan. And of course, I could have, instead of a Nanhua temple, I would also have liked to pick a temple in, for example, Brazil, also very important regional headquarters, or looked at the Foguangshan activities in India. Foguangshan is, as I said, globally active everywhere, so it was impossible to pick all. But that was my reasons to pick those three temples. And of course, in addition to my main field site, where I spent 90 days each, I would also spend being located in Germany, I would spend regular visits in Berlin, and also being quite often in Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan. I would, of course, also always regular visit Foguangshan facilities in Hong Kong and Singapore. But those were all like short-term visits, not just stays. So, and then one more point, it's, space was an important category. So it was really important for me, okay, how do we define space, right? What is the Buddhist space per se? And of course, the Buddhist space per se is the temple space, right? Temple space is really where we can see all these activities. In a moment, I will give you an overview of all these activities, but it's also the space that connects this whole global Foguangshan global temple net. And as I said before, my main research methods were classical ethnographic research methods, participant observation, non-participant observation, semi-structured open-ended interviews, informal conversation, and analysis of print and online material. So to come back to the temple space, so temple space was really an important category of space for me, because here it's kind of where everything happens, right? Temple space has many functions, religious ones, social one, administrative one. First of all, it is of course a ritual space, right? There is the main Buddha hall, there is many Fa Hoi or Dharma assemblies taking place, repentances, morning service, evening service. In addition to ritual spaces, also a space for religious cultivation. So people go to the temple to meditate, they go to recite the Buddha's name. They do sometimes book clubs to study the scriptures, study the writings of Venerable Master Xing Yun. Sometimes they have calligraphy writing, scripture writing, Buddhist sutra writing. But of course, there's many other functions too, right? There's also a space for recreational and leisure activities. People come to the temple because it's a beautiful space, right? Especially in a region here like Southern California. Besides malls, there isn't really many parks, there isn't really many public spaces to go to. But Shila Temple is an open, inviting space with bright colors, sometimes music, sometimes festivities. So people just go there, stroll over the temple grounds, take a picture. And of course, it has always historically been the case with temples, with churches. They were not just places of religious cultivation, they were always also recreational and leisure spaces. Furthermore, Shilai Temple is of course also an educational space, not just Shilai Temple, all Foguangshan temples, right? Foguangshan temples, most of them run schools, especially the bigger ones. On the picture, we're seeing Nanhua Temple in the background. They run schools. For sometimes it's Dharma schools, very often, mostly they have Chinese schools for the second and later generation, where they teach them Chinese, but they also have fun activities or teach the three goodness campaigns. Sometimes, they have, like in the case of Shilai Temple, they have actual school buildings within the temple ground, or as here, newly constructed right next to the temple grounds. Then, of course, temples have dining halls, and some of these dining halls many Buddhist Foguangshan temples are actually open to the public, sometimes only on some days. In the case of Shilai Temple, it's at least before the pandemic every day. Of course, then we had to close down here, but now it's reopened. And it's a very popular lunch option for people who work in the region, not just Buddhists, for all kinds of people who want to come, grab a Chinese vegetarian lunch. have a little break from the work before they go back to work. And other temples, some have both, like Nanhua Temple and Xilai Temple. Other temples have a dining hall, have no dining hall, have a water drop tea house. Sometimes they have in the temple, sometimes there's extra, which is, a tea house, again, where people can go, have a snack, grab some tea. There's books of Master Xingyun, there might be sutras, they can, read, they can interact with the volunteers. And in addition, it is of course also a cultural space. Many Fogwanshan temples have museum spaces, have galleries, right? Like in these galleries, people can come to look at calligraphies, look at art shows, and of course, cultural activities are not only take only place within the gallery, but Chinese, especially Chinese New Year, big Chinese holidays take place in the temple, attract thousands, 10,000 of visitors who come to the temple to experience Chinese culture. Some go there, of course, to pray, some go there just to enjoy the atmosphere. Some are ethnic Chinese, some are Vietnamese, and some are non-Asians, of all backgrounds, go to the temple to really experience, especially around Chinese New Year, this very lively and celebrative atmosphere. But it's of course also, especially in diaspora, is of course also a social space, right? Many people come here, especially if they're like the little elder, they live with their children are working, they're home alone, they go to the temple, they can speak their language, can speak Mandarin, can speak Minanhua, can speak Cantonese, and can interact with people of origin from, have similar migration history or spaces of origin. It is of course also a space to volunteer, like especially for Buddhist temples, we have also spaces for volunteering, but especially in the case of Fogwanshan, volunteering plays a very important role also as a cultivation practice. And of course, it is also the space where the monastics live, where administration takes place, and where monastics and lay interact. So it's really a central space if we want to understand what goes on in Fogwanshan's globalization project. So let me talk a little bit about the structure, move on to the content of the book, the actual content. So what I did first is really, as I said before, kind of try to apply a longue durée kind of framework, starting from after the Opium Wars, moving on until today. Then in the next 4 chapters, I tried to contrast this historical perspective with an ethnographic perspective, talking about the people engaged. And then I've really structured the whole chapters according to Fogwanshan's official motto, which is using culture, education, philanthropy, and communal religious cultivation as a means to spread the Dharma. And in the conclusion, then I try to link all the collected data to the before mentioned 3 academic discourses. Let me sum a word before I go on. I'll be very quick here. There's this very famous saying, traduttore, traditore, is an Italian saying, means the translator is lying or is always wrong, right? Because how do we translate key terms? It's always, whenever we translate something, the translated term is never 100% the same, right? So that's also the big problem if you translate 人间佛教, right? Or 现代汉传佛教. There's some, yeah. So depending on my audience, sometimes I use humanistic Buddhism, which is of course the official English translation preferred by Fogwanshan and other humanistic Buddhist organizations in Taiwan, but especially in Europe, the US too, but especially in Europe, people associate humanism is of course based on Renaissance European history and has a very strong anti-clerical flavor to it. But of course, within humanistic Buddhism or Fogwanshan, monastics play an important role, which is in my writings, I use the term Renjin Buddhism. However, today I'm going to use them interchangeably, right? Because my audience today is very familiar with Renjin Fojiao, so I don't have to explain what it means. And then, of course, monastics play an important role. Similar, Hanchuan Fojiao is modern Chinese Buddhism, modernist Chinese, Synodic, modernist Mahāyāna. It's all these, there's different ways of translating those terms. For my book, I have used the term modern Chinese Buddhism. Okay, let's move on to my historical chapter. So to understand Fogwanshan's transnationalism, or the transnationalism of humanistic Buddhism, we really have to look at it from its beginning. And of course, humanistic Buddhism from its beginning was always extremely transnational, right? It's kind of developed out of a response of a perceived crisis of Buddhism in the 19th century, after the Opium Wars, after China's encounter with European colonialism and imperialism, right? At the time, obviously, there was lots of turmoil. China was in the transitioning phase from dynastic to republican China. All kinds of institutions were problematized by Chinese intellectuals and Chinese elites. And of course, being subject to European colonialism, there was always the question, how can we strengthen China? How can we, or who's responsible for China being weak and not being able to defend themselves against the colonial powers and being threatened to be sliced up as a melon? That was a common saying at the time. And Chinese intellectuals at the time turned towards many of their traditional systems, for example, Confucianism, but also Buddhism, especially those modernist intellectuals, to blame for these developments. And of course, Buddhist actors were not happy about it and really tried to counter these allegations by modernizing Buddhism and reconstructing Buddhism as a modern religion. And modern religion means here, of course, a religion that is able to contribute to the building of China as a modern nation state, right? To stand all these pressures from overseas. And so an important aspect here is, of course, which is sometimes, if you look at modern Buddhism in the West, we always have this idea of modernization equals secularization. That might be an idea that has long been out of fashion in academia, but it's still very present in people's minds. So, but what we really overlook is the important role within the modern era of the nation state and the important role of the nation state for the modernization of religious traditions. So there's something, especially Prashanjit Dwara, sinologist, also an historian, always stresses, right? So if we, at the time, of course, there was many new influence, ideas, words coming from overseas into China. The word religion itself is, of course, a neologism that went to Japan, came from Japan to China. The whole idea of having religion, having a secular sphere in society, and having something as superstition was new introduced to China, and the whole society was reordered according to these terms. And of course, for Buddhist actors, it was very important to not be categorized as, for example, superstition, right? They had to show that like a religion, and a modern religion in that sense, that they used the term religion, was modeled after the idea of Protestantism, especially an Anglo-Saxon idea of Protestantism, which is, one church, one community, one scripture, engaged in education, engaged in philanthropy. So Buddhists were very important to show that they're as modern as Protestants, and actually even more. Right, so there was a very important dynamic that took place, and in an important text on socially engaged Buddhism, Jessica Main and Rong Dao Lai argue actually that secularization, in a sense, is the mirror image of engaged Buddhism. Right, so the idea of secularization is not just the absence of religion; it's a political project that was introduced from the West to kind of get religious actors out of the society into clearly restricted spaces, such as the temple, or especially the private space. But for socially engaged Buddhists, such as humanistic Buddhists, Rinzai Buddhists, such as Venerable Taishu, was very important to make clear it's society that is the space of Buddhist cultivation, right? It does not mean to get rid of ritual, to completely get rid of Buddhist scriptures and of the Buddhist teaching. It just meant that Buddhism had to take place in the Renjian, in the society, and not just somewhere on the mountains far away from the world. Another important pan-Buddhist or transnational aspect of early Renjian Buddhism, early 20th century Renjian Buddhism, was, of course, its engagement with overseas. So it's not just Buddhists at the time, such as Taishu, such as many other Buddhist reformers, were not just active within China, of course, they were also engaged in, they were traveling outside. They were going to Taishu and to, to Japan, even to America. Sri Lankan modernist Buddhists came to China. So there was lots of travel amongst Buddhist reformist elites, global. Many of Buddhist reformers went to Southeast Asia, to the diaspora there. So Buddhism, even the early Rinzin Buddhist or humanistic Buddhist movement, although mainly contained to the core regions in Asia, was already quite mobile, right? Although even it was mainly elite figures, it wasn't as big as today. So what I'm doing then in my book is to, because I don't want to not just Taishu, just show like how a whole group, Taishu, Inshun, Yanpei, Zihang, all these modernist monastics who were very, very active in moving to Southeast Asia, to Hong Kong, to all these islands, to Taiwan, and spread their vision of a modern Chinese Buddhism over there. And of course, 1949 was somewhat of a juncture when many of those Buddhists, modernist Buddhists, went to places like Hong Kong, also the US, and also Taiwan. And the center of mainland Chinese Buddhism for some decades, moved from the mainland to the outskirts to Taiwan, where, of course, then Foguangshan was established by Venerable Master Xing, but also other groups such as Tiji, such as Fagushan, Zhongtaishan was another humanistic Buddhist group, and of course, many smaller Buddhist temples also are very active. Then I'm closing that chapter with my empirical part on the development of Foguangshan, really looking at which regions developed first. So of course, Malaysia was important. Then America was extremely important in the early days, 70s, 80s, 90s. Of course, Europe came in the 90s, South Africa, and from the 2000s on, of course, mainland China. Of course, that's also many more I didn't mention now, Korea, Japan. Yes, that's the part I'm sketching more, focusing on the more detailed development. That's how I end the historical chapter. So my two main arguments in this chapter are really that Rinzin or humanistic Buddhism is highly transnational from its beginnings. At the beginning, transnationalism took more place in Asia by, receiving ideas, but modifying these ideas in their own sense and according to their own needs. But of course, then with from the mid of the second part of the after 20th century on, Rinzin Buddhism really spread over the whole globe and to the current highly globalized state. Right, and the second key argument I make here is we have to really understand to this background to clearly see the specific modern disposition, which is then important later when, of course, humanistic Buddhism meets other modern Buddhist religiosities in spaces such as LA or otherwhere outside of Asia. So my next chapter is really looking at who are those people who we can, who made Foguangshans, besides Venerable Master Xing, and besides the monastic, of course, who are those people who are in the temples who made Foguangshan's impressive global spread possible? Excuse me. So one thing which is, of course, clear, it's really important to see the importance here of transnational ethnic Chinese migration. 1965 has seen is somewhat of a juncture here, because there have been, from then on, important changes in migration policies worldwide. So early Chinese migration, of course, happened mainly from the three coastal areas, Fujian, Guangdong, and the southern areas of China. There was coolie migration, there was working class migration, really linked to the colonial project, who were Chinese, moved then to places like South Africa, already like the US, were engaged in also the building of the railroad. Well, it's a very different migration than the migration we see after 1965. Right after 1965 is, of course, after the beginning of the Cold War. There's a whole change in the equilibrium of the global power and economic dynamics, economic development in Asia, many countries of Asia, and that really has caused this new form or these changes in migration policies. from the late 19th century on until the mid-20th century on, non-European migration was banned from places like the US, like Canada, like Australia. They had very racist migration policies. But from the 1960s on, that was about to change. And we can see a completely new generation of ethnic Chinese migrants appearing on the global stage. Very highly globally minded, middle-class Chinese migrants, middle class and above. And this was, of course, Wang Gongwu so famously called the upgrading of the Chinese migrant, right? So we have new migration channels. Education was a very important one. Of course, at the time, not everybody, today we live in a time of mass education, but of course, in the 60s, not everybody could go to universities. So those who were able to go to universities in Asian countries were, of course, belonged to the elites, right? And then they moved to places like the US and other places, like South Africa, like Europe, like Canada, like Australia. Another important migration channel, especially for South Africa, was investment, so business investment, which of course also is a completely different social formation than these really earlier coolie or working class migration that we've seen 100 years before. And that really also had an impact on what happens on the form of settlement, right? So when you see the early forms of Chinese settlement outside of Asia is what's so famously called the Chinatown, right? But many Chinatowns had very bad living conditions. It was very dense. Many people lived together in small apartments. But of course, after 1965, with this new arrival of this new generation of Chinese migrants, they went directly into the suburbs, right? So the suburbs is the space of, now kind of it's changing again, but in the second half of the 20th century, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries or Anglophone countries, there was this move into the suburbs of the middle classes. And now, of course, those Chinese migrants also directly moved into the suburbs, which the American geographer Wei Li has then called the ethnoburb. For example, here, the San Gabriel Valley is a huge suburban area with lots of people of ethnic Chinese origin. And something that also was brought along with this change in these demographics of migration was, of course, a move from Cantonese to Mandarin, right? So before, Cantonese was the dominant Chinese dialect or language in the diaspora or globally outside of Sinophone societies in Asia. However, that was then replaced by Mandarin, right? We have the development of national education in China, in Taiwan, in Singapore. And also we have then coming with it the idea of Mandarin as a language that is taught to everybody. It's like the dominant language. And of course, that is also reflected in the diaspora. And a very important concept I'm using in my book is the idea of a layered diaspora, right? People came from different regions in Asia, but at different times too. So the first who came were, of course, the first ethnic Chinese migrants who came to places like the US were, of course, from Taiwan, later from ethnic Chinese from Southeast Asia, places like Singapore and Malaysia, maybe Philippines, later then from Vietnam, Sino-Vietnamese from Vietnam, and of course, especially from the 2000s on, increasingly a completely new generation now from mainland China, right? So we have different layers, and we can really see through the establishment of Fo Guangshan temples how in the beginning everybody at these temples were Taiwanese, and now if you go to the Xilai temple, we can see the abbot is mainland Chinese, is from Beijing. We have temple visitors are from increasingly from China, but also many from Vietnam, Sino-Vietnamese from Vietnam. So we really can see a change within this highly diverse ethnic Chinese diaspora community, and how this diversity is reflected over time also in the temples. Of course, in this chapter, I'm also talking about the second and later generations and about non-Chinese who are at these temples, who play a somewhat different role since the main language is Mandarin, and the second and later generations very often prefer to speak the local language, as do the non-Chinese. And one more thing I might have to add here is, of course, that those characteristics really apply to these developments outside of Sinophone countries, right? So if you look at the situation in mainland China, it's of course completely different because the Foguangshan Temple in mainland China does not serve a Taiwanese community in China, but is really meant to the broader Chinese public, right? That's what we see if you go to Yixing, to Dazhou Temple, we just people who live there, of course, or come from Hangzhou, from further apart. So it's really, of course, there we see like different dynamics in terms of ethnic, like temple visitors than we see in temples they are located in the diaspora. So my next chapter then is really looking, or the next 3 chapters actually really following the official motto of Foguangshan, which Venerable Master Xing Yun developed when Foguangshan was founded in 1967, which until today are the guidelines of Foguangshan's not just global development, of all of their social engagements, or social Buddhist social engagements. So, of course, one very important thing is culture, like to use culture to spread the Dharma. But however, if you look at the role of culture overseas, it means Chinese culture, right? If you go to Taiwan or China, and culture is, of course, just culture. If you do the guzheng or guqin there, it's just a musical instrument. If you see calligraphy, so culture means different things in different spaces. Of course, if you have a guzheng or concert here in Xilai Temple, it is perceived as Chinese culture. So the role of representing Chineseness plays a big role in the diaspora. But for example, in Yixing, culture plays a different role, right? One thing what is done at Dazhou Temple is there's an annual fair of vegetarian food to promote vegetarianism. So it's vegetarian Buddhist culture which is promoted there, which is somewhat different, of course, different context than the context of America or South Africa. So what we see in these like non-majority ethnic Chinese spaces is that Foguangshan really operates with 2 renderings of Chineseness, right? One is really directed at the general public or at everybody, and the other one is more specific. So one is more ethno-parochial, and the other one is more open and inclusive. So the first one is, of course, really Chineseness as a cultural event. So what we see is when, especially Chinese New Year, really attracts, it's visibly from afar. There's so much traffic. People go there. There's lion dances. I do my research myself. I was a part of I'm not of the lion, but of the dragon dance team. There is food. There's all kinds of activities. Of course, there's also chanting. There's pilgrimages, prostration. So there's religious, cultures, all mixed together. It's very lively. It's very attractive. There's music. It's really a place where, of course, ethnic Chinese people like to go because it reminds them of their cultures of origin, but also neighbors or Sino-Vietnamese, whoever lives there, Latino Americans or European Americans, African Americans, like people just go there and experience kind of Chineseness in a way that follows like the rules, or not the rules, the conventions of global event culture, right? But on the other hand, Foguangshan is also not just a Buddhist space, but consciously presents itself as a preserver of traditional Chinese culture. And traditional Chinese culture here, in a sense, as Zhonghua Wenhua, right? Which is a modern term coined in the early 20th century, a selective. Of course, it's impossible, 2,000 or 5,000, however you want to count, however many years of Chinese culture to all distill. But there's this like modern distillation of what represents traditional Chinese culture. And there's these schools, there's Chinese language schools, and those are really focusing on the ethnic Chinese diaspora and their children. All right, so these kind of later activities, they're really linking the diaspora back to imagine China, imagine not in the sense that China doesn't exist, but in the sense of Anderson, right? It's like they're living in the diaspora, and it links them back to their imagined China of their origin, and kind of transcends the particularities of the diaspora here, which is somewhat, especially in the case of the US, like every space of origin has their different area of settling in the Sangambia Valley. But within this temple space, there is this narrative of we Chinese. And of course, that's especially for the first generation, which is the majority of those we can encounter in those temples, very important and really contributes to the success of Fenghuangshan overseas. That's something that always came up in my interviews with ethnic Chinese that I visit from all kinds of origin, be it from Taiwan, from China, from Singapore, from Vietnam, that I interviewed in this temple space. Not to say, of course, there's also other identities, right? Ethnic Chinese identities are, of course, very complex in the diaspora, but there was one, and it was the dominant one, and that was present within these temple spaces. However, these exhibited Chineseness also, as I said, is really attract non-Chinese, especially around those, those holidays, but also, for example, in South Africa, when there was like a certain activity, like some, Kung Fu monks on TV, on the national TV, there was always days when when tourism or when locals was increased on local tourism to the Nanhua temple. People didn't have to fly, spend thousands of dollars to fly to China. They could just hop on a car, drive there, and really experience Chinese culture, in a very accessible way. And of course, also this focus on the Chinese identity has allowed Fenghuangshan to connect with the People's Republic of China, where since the Reform and opening, the earlier anti-imperialist notions and ideologies were replaced by a more national culture narrative. I'm moving on to the next chapters. In a way, this next one could have been two, because here I'm merging two mottos, right? One is to use education to groom or to human talent. And the second one is, of course, to use philanthropy to contribute to society. But since those two are in the literature actually the most researched, I thought for my own book, I'll just merge them together. Very important here is, of course, as mentioned before, the influence of the early 20th century humanistic Buddhist ideas of a modern religion is contributing to society, is engaged in civic engagements. So Fenghuangshan in Taiwan runs kindergartens, child education centers, elementary and middle schools. It has 5 universities worldwide, 3 of those overseas. One is in the Philippines, one is in Australia, of course, and of course I'm located at Hilai, or University of the West right now in Los Angeles. But it has various very small charity and also smaller educational facilities all over the world, right? I just already mentioned the schools and the temples. There's a cemetery here. There's all kinds of activities going on in the temples and outside of the temple spaces, engaged in we're having a health fair coming up soon, environmental activities. The whole is too much to all. There's not enough time now to list them all right now. And it's really important, this kind of civic engagement spirit of the early 20th century to contribute to the greater good of society. And by doing so, Fenghuangshan also established, it's not just an inheritance from the earlier generations of humanistic Buddhism, it is really to establish itself as a civic actor in the host society, right? Thereby interacting, leaving the temple state, the temple space, moving into society, right? For example, the cultural engagements, one could say, they're kind of connecting the temple back to an imagined China. And here's like going outwards out of the temple into the host society. So both are transnational movements that connect the temple with the outside world. Which is also very interesting is, of course, there's a soft approach to proselytization, right? In contrast to many many Christian schools overseas and Christian charities, especially of evangelical flavor, they really have a strong focus on proselytization, which is, of course, not what Venerable Master Xing Yin had in mind and was Fenghuangshan engaging in. It's more like creating a positive model, right? Paying back to society, thereby hoping to planting the seeds of the Dharma, to give the Dharma the chance to really naturally set ground in those countries. And an example here is my picture on the right is the Nanhua Performing Arts Group, which is one of the schools run by Nanhua Temple, and who is a performance arts boarding school where young women from rural areas can learn, especially Chinese drums, but also African drums. And they also perform. Actually, in the picture, they were very successful. They even got on TV until South Africa. A very popular show is called South Africa's Talent, Best Talent or something. I'm not a big TV watcher. But they only made second, but at least second was a big deal. I mean, a national exposure. And so they really acted as what the abbot calls cultural ambassadors, right? Some of the temple visitors, especially those who are not really familiar with the writings of Master Xing Yun, so might be just casual temple visitors, will come to the abbot and say, okay, why do we spend all this money on, like, on schools, on all these activities, and they're not even, we don't even require the Nanhua Performing Arts students to become Buddhists, so why wasting all this money? But the abbot, which is, in my opinion, of course, very much in the spirit of Venerable Master Xing Yun, but the abbot always made clear it's not about forcing the Dharma on people. It's really being like cultural ambassadors, showing a positive role model in society and having a very soft approach to proselytization, which strongly contrasts to other maybe more Christian or evangelical models. But of course, this approach also does create revenue back in Taiwan and in Asia, not just in Taiwan. For example, the Nanhua Performing Arts Group, they are traveling, they're going on an Asia tour once a year, right? They're broadcasted by the Fenghuangshan media. Fenghuangshan has, of course, a TV channel, has newspapers, has a whole media empire, and broadcasting all these, not just the Nanhua Performing Arts Group, all their many educational, civic engagements, philanthropic engagements, also really then creates revenues back in Taiwan. So for the Fenghuangshan or BLIA members in Taiwan, they're seeing, okay, all the good that is done. It enforces their sense of contributing to the greater good of society. So it's kind of really creating a circle here. So the next chapter is focusing on the genuinely religious part of Fenghuangshan's global project. And that was something that was specifically important to me, because very often if we have listened to people speaking about humanistic Buddhism, there's always this notion of, oh, it's secularized, right? It's completely secularized. It's kind of, it's only social or civic engagements. But of course, those of us who are very familiar with the activities of Fenghuangshan know that is a very one-sided picture, an incomplete picture. And Fenghuangshan has, of course, provides a huge range of cultivation practices, ranging from the before-mentioned Dharma assemblings, morning service, evening service, repentances, sutra copying, volunteering, meditation retreats, weekend meditation courses, book clubs, reading the writings of Venerable Master Xing Yun, but also reading sutras. Excuse me. Reciting the name of the Buddha Amitabha. So there's a whole range, the whole spectrum of cultivation practices in the Chinese Mahāyāna can, of course, also be found at Fenghuangshan, and in fact play a very important role in the daily temple schedule. Another important aspect is, of course, volunteering. Volunteering was always a religious practice in Buddhism, especially in the past, of course, for lay Buddhists, right? There's this divide of labor between lay Buddhists and monastics, of course, and the lay Buddhists, they create the dana, they create merit by donating, but also donating not just money or goods or food, but of course also labor and time. So that's of course in itself a very, very age-old Buddhist practice. What is different though is that in modern Chinese Buddhism, from the 20th and 19th century on, and these forms of religious practice became much or more and more institutionalized. So what we can see in the early 20th century here is also somewhat of a divide between, I mean, not a complete divide, but becoming more independent of lay Buddhist associations who are not as attached to one specific temple. Of course, what we see with Fo Guang Shan is that divide or this gap is then yet closed again, and the relationship between the monastics and the lay Buddhists are actually quite close compared to traditional forms of Buddhism in history, right? So we see that the divide is getting much more porous in the modern area. And very important for Fo Guang Shan is, of course, the so-called Fo Guang Hui, or Buddha's Light International Association, which is the lay body or the lay wing. A common picture is perceiving Fo Guang Shan and BLIA as the two wings, right? Fo Guang Shan is the monastic wing, BLIA is the lay wing. That is, of course, not 100% correct because there is monastic engagement within the BLIA, but it is a majority lay organization. And what is interesting is what we can see here at the BLIA. It's, of course, there is still many ways of getting engaged with a temple, right? So not everybody who is at a Fo Guang Shan temple is a BLIA member. It is only those who are more committed. However, that is an option that has historically non-existed. So that is something that is a modern option. And interestingly, if you look at the literature on Buddhism in the West, when they then kind of try to differentiate between modern Buddhism, and in these books, European American Buddhism is perceived as the modern Buddhism. There always is this narrative of exactly this institutionalized form of lay engagement as a proof of traditionalism, which of course historically is completely wrong because it's a modern development, right? So it's not just a simple dichotomy of individualism and group identity. All these group forms are very, very modern, like the nation state, built on modern developments worldwide. And this strong group identity at the BLIA is expressed in many different ways. One thing is that Fo Guang Shan Buddhists, of course, identify as Buddhists, they identify as Mahāyāna Buddhists, they identify as Chinese Buddhists, or Han Fo Jiao with the Chinese Mahāyāna, they identify as all these broader terms, with humanistic Buddhism, of course, but they also call themselves Fo Guang people, right? And it is, of course, a very new and modern development that we haven't seen until, let's say, 60, 70 years before, right? So it's a very strong group identity, which is also expressed in terms of garments. Many who have participated in Fo Guang Shan events, or if not, then have seen maybe Tzu Chi, who's like at train stations. Tzu Chi has a similar concept. They have people wear a certain clothing, right? And for Mahāyāna, it's a very, very, I mean, there's mainly two colors. There's the maroon vest for people who volunteer for a temple. There's the yellow BLIA vests who have like, very bright. They have the BLIA logo at the back, and they have the BLIA here in Chinese characters. So it's very visible, and people wear those vests together. So when they wear those vests, when they appear somewhere as a group, and there's of course a whole set of rules also for how to be a Fo Guang person, right? There are certain certain rights that you have. You can require monastics to assist with chanting of certain, but of course there's also certain duties. And it's a very elaborated system. There's forms of practice of what is supposed to engage in, personal practice, but also group practice. And of course, there's also a new development of in regards to phraseology, which is, most of us, I assume, especially with the audience today, probably everyone has went to a Chinese Mahāyāna temple. And of course, the common greeting is to say Amitofo. However, in the last decades, Foguangshan has adjusted and changed. It has developed its own way of greeting each other, which is, of course, Jixiang. So it's a different way of greeting, which is supposed to have a less strong religious flavor and be like more welcoming, more friendly. And also, of course, the word Amitofo is very much related or associated with notions of dying and death culture and funeral culture. So moving to a more positive, using a more positive word. But the important part is here that we really see it, a group develops their own phraseology, right? Which of course also then feeds into or strengthens, increases this stronger sense of a group identity. So what is interesting here in comparison, I'm a little too quick, so we might stop a little before time, but I'm not quite done yet. I'm just realizing. But what is interesting here is if we compare those chapters before, we could really see that in terms of, although the majority of people at Foguangshan temples is first-generation ethnic Chinese migrants at Foguangshan temples overseas, we could see that in the realms of culture, of philanthropy, of charity, there is of course lots of cross-cultural mixing going on, right? There is people attending the Chinese New Year's festivities together, right? There's right next to each, they're going in, there's people of all backgrounds participating in these activities. Same if you have looking at the educational activities, right? We have here, for example, our school is a very international school. We have, of course, the Americans of European origins. We have overseas students from mainland China, from Taiwan, from East Asia, from Korea, and lots from South Asia, from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka, from Southeast Asia, from, of course, Central America, although mainly Americans of Central American origin. So we have here really these other activities, there's all kinds of mixing and overlapping going on. And the main divide is still, of course, dictated by the language, right? There's the local language spaces and then there's the Mandarin language spaces. But despite this language divide, there is still a good degree of cross-cultural and also cross-class interaction going on, right? As I said before, lots of the majority of those ethnic Chinese migrants belong to the middle and upper strata of society in their countries of origin, and then also in their countries of settlement. But of course, many of the, especially of the philanthropic engagements of Foguangshan, they're focused on those maybe of the lower strata, right? Those who are in need. And here we also see then there is some cross-class interaction within all these fields. However, interestingly, in the case of religious cultivation, we find the least degree of interaction. And that really is based, of course, one aspect is language, but I argue that is not the main reason. My argument is really, that is really boils down to those different understandings of what constitutes a modernist or modern Buddhist religiosity in countries of Asia and outside of Asia, right? So we have this very strong equation in, for example, the US, but of course also in Europe and also in Australia, Canada, other places, of Buddhism and meditation. Like Buddhism is meditation and nothing else. That is really a very common perception in the US. And that is, of course, somewhat different with this idea, with all this range of Buddhist cultivation practices I just mentioned, right? So when we have morning services, we have evening services, so there's lots of chanting, and we have Dharma assemblies, so which are, of course, ritual engagements, Fa Hoi, that have work of all kinds of levels, right? They create certain merits and are supposed to create certain effects on the practitioner. They also form to really, because we are reciting scripture, reciting sutras, right? So you're also engaging with these religious ideas. It's also a group. There's like a communal aspect, which is very important. You know, most of these before mentioned formal activities are all done in a group. So as you see, 以公修 精华人心. So 公修, like communal practice, is really at the heart, as something that is to be done as a group, but there's many different options of things that can be done as a group, right? It's not just meditation. Meditation is, of course, one example. And it's very important also to make the point, of course, Chinese Buddhists meditate, and because that's often then the other stereotype which we find in the literature on Buddhism in the West, that Western or European origin Buddhists meditate, and Asian original Buddhists of Asian origin in the West, they only engage in chanting or in volunteering, which is of course not true. Like if you look at during my time at Xilai Temple, there was of course a Chinese language and an English language meditation group, and there was the Chinese language meditation group, which was an advanced meditation group, while the English language one was a beginner one. The situation was even more obvious in South Africa. South Africa would have occasion, I think every 2 weeks or once a month or every 2 weeks, they would have a meditation retreat in English. The retreat in English was a very, very, not very demanding. There was, I think, basically one real session of sitting meditation, half an hour. There was cultural classes, temple tours, tea and snacks, having tea, lying on the floor, listening, like lying music meditation. It was very, very basic forms of meditation. However, what the temple also would do regular Chan Qi or week meditation retreats, and those were then the retreats the Chinese speakers attended. So the more advanced retreats were all attended by Chinese speakers, which shows us, of course, that ethnic Chinese Buddhists are as engaged as meditation, if not more. It's just meditation. It's just one of many, many, many cultivation practices they can choose from. And that is, of course, historically always been the case, right? Historically, not just, now we're speaking about the Chinese Mahāyāna, but Buddhism in general, but Chinese Mahāyāna had many cultivation practices besides just meditation. And that is something we can see. Very interestingly, we have this divide only here in the field of religious cultivation. Okay, so let me move on to my conclusion. And since we have time, I have prepared two conclusions, the quick one and the slightly longer one. So let me do the quick one first, and then I go, since I still have some time, into the longer conclusion. So in conclusion, what we see here is Religion Buddhism is really, or humanistic Buddhism is really shaped by transnational dynamics from its beginnings on. Right, so it's from its time, and of course one could argue Buddhism was always transnational, right? Buddhism was always mobile. Buddhism, of course, comes from South Asia, moves to Central Asia, also moves to the Maritime Road. Famously, Dr. Lancaster here has shown to China. But being mobile does not necessarily mean being transnational, right? Because transnational, we really need, there is this idea of the nation state in here. So trans-regional, translocative is not the same. Buddhism was, of course, always a mobile religion, but by saying it was always a transnational religion means, of course, it was linked to these early 19th century, late colonial, whole dynamics where the world changed from its very diverse forms of political organization. There's empires, there's kingdoms, there's dukedoms, to the system of the nation-state system, right? So this, from the mid-century on of the 20th century, there is nation states everywhere. We can really see that nation states and the crossing of national borders has shaped the development of nation states. The end of imperialism has really shaped humanistic Buddhism from its beginning. In the beginning, in its establishment in China, and then from 1965 is somewhat marks somewhat of a juncture, like a breaking or important point, where we see that these new power dynamics worldwide, globally, the Cold War, the changing, the development, economic development in Asia, and we can really see how then this change in migration policies really creates the conditions through this emergence of the new Chinese migrant, or the upgraded Chinese migrants, creates the conditions for the second phase of transnational development of Fo Guangshan. And Venerable Master Xing Yun has, as no other, really kind of took or recognized the opportunity and has, as no other, accomplished to really successfully spread Fo Guangshan over the whole globe. So the next point is, of course, what is really important in my book is it plays out in the context of a complex and layered ethnic Chinese diaspora. So why am I stressing these points so much? I'm stressing this point because very much in the literature, especially in Buddhism in the West, you find this dichotomy, right? There's the Western Buddhists, and Western Buddhists means European American Buddhists, is mainly American literature. And then there's the Asian Buddhists. And they do all, the Asians do all that, and the other ones do meditation, and the Asians all do like recitation. But what I'm arguing is that it's a highly, highly oversimplified picture, right? And even if we just look at the ethnic Chinese, we can see that it's a highly complex and layered community. And, you know, spreading out, I haven't talked about that aspect a lot today, but moving from the Taiwanese and expanding to the Southeast Asian and then to the mainland Chinese diaspora is really connecting with Chinese of different, not just of different spaces of origin, but also of different ideas what a modern Buddhist religiosity is supposed to do, right? For a Taiwanese, it is very clear, it's very familiar. Fo Guangshan is present in the media. Humanistic Buddhism is something very present. For someone who is like maybe a Sino-Vietnamese or maybe like a migrant from mainland China, very often they're coming to temple and they're like somewhat irritated in the beginning by that high degree of social engagement, right? And it's something then the monastics or the abbots or the volunteers have to explain to them. It's because their ideas, especially in the case of mainland China, very often come sometimes even from Hong Kong movies, from ideas of like there's these temples somewhere in the mountains, everybody's just meditating or reciting. And it's a very different than this like modern Buddhist reality of a socially, culturally engaged Buddhist temple, right? So having crossed these boundaries is also took Fo Guangshan, of course, many decades, and there were of certain efforts involved, and I'm going talking about that part more in my, especially in my writings on the South African case, where we can really see, because of we can really see that there's this movement and the expansion from in early times when 90 and 100% of the people we find in the temple are of Taiwanese origin, and then we will see by now in the BLIA. In some BLIA chapters, is already 80% of the membership is from of mainland Chinese origin. So we can really see the change within those generations. Because of course, age also plays a role, right? Since the Taiwanese left earlier, many of them now have reached a certain age, which of course allows them to be engaged, gives them the time. Many of them also are wealthy enough to have the time and the financial means to go to the temple and engage as volunteers. While if you see with these newer generations of Chinese migrants from the mainland, they just arrived in the new countries, host countries. They're very busy working, building businesses. They don't have time to go, take off a whole week and take part in the Emperor Liang Dharma repentance, for example, right? So we can really see this picture is much more complex than just ethnic Chinese and non-Chinese. There's a high degree of internal diversity, and of course it gets more complex than if we also add on the question of the second and the later generations, which I haven't had a chance to speak much about today, but which is also part of one of the chapters of my books, at least in passing. And one thing I'm really arguing, and since I have 10 minutes left, I'll let me go into that last point in a little bit more detail. So we should really move away from the idea of modern Buddhism. So what I suggest then is to suggest to use modern Buddhist religiosity, or one of many modern Buddhist religiosities. And that is, of course, linked to the idea of, is there one or many modernities, right? Sometimes we think modern is kind of like this universal kind of thing, and a modern country is like a secular country, and all modern countries are on the same path. But of course, empirically, that has never been the case. Modern societies can be vastly different, and the situation of religion in these societies can also be vastly different. I mean, mainland China appears here as a very modern country, but very different from the US. The US is very modern, but very different from Germany. Germany is very modern, but different again from Japan, right? So we can see how modern societies have, of course, similar characteristics, differentiation of labor, but there's also many differences in how they are internally structures. And this idea about multiple non-Western modernities is, of course, goes back to Shmuel Eisenberg in sociological literature. And what it allows us to see is, if you're moving away, if you understand modernity in its multiplicity, we're moving away from this idea of modernity and tradition as like a dichotomy, right? It's like in the past we had tradition, was all superstition, and then we have the modernity, and now everything is the same and rational. And that is, of course, not the case. Neither are traditions completely absent, but it also allows us then to see modern religion as not as a religion that is completely secularized, as some forms of Western Buddhism, such as the mindfulness movement, right, where there is no more or very little talk of the Dharma, or of notions of rebirth or karma or the sutras, but it's basically all boiled down to meditation as a psychological tool, and that's the only understanding of modernized Buddhism, to a relationship of modernity and tradition that is maybe more complex, as in the case of Shan, where modernity is not meant to replace tradition or be at the expense of tradition, but meaning to make tradition applicable and applicable to the modern times, and adapted to modern society and the needs of contemporary urban modern people and Buddhists, right? And that is, of course, a very big difference of the Shan approach, and of course also many other Asian Buddhist groups, and to the dominant Western model, which really understands, or mainly understands, Buddhism as a psychology or meditational tool. So, and I'm closing. I'm a little bit before time, but I'm about to close. So what we see now as my outlook for the future is, so what we have now is we have this encounter of different modern Buddhist religiosities, and these encounter happens particularly, well, it maybe happen less in places like Germany, where Shan Buddhism is still, Humanistic Buddhism is relatively small, but of course in a place as big as LA, where we have such a big mixing and meshing going on, and especially like a school like Xilai or University of the West, we can really see how all these different models of modern Buddhist religiosities interact and encounter each other. We can see that we have Buddhists from Sri Lanka, who's of course also another form yet of a very modernized Theravada. And of course, we have the chaplaincy program, which is much more engaged in Western form of Buddhist religiosities, while many of their students also are coming from Asian countries. So we really are now in a stage where, until now, there was a lot of coexistence and not as much cooperation or communication, but at least that is my hope, and I'm closing with a more normative statement here. And there's something at least I observe here, that we are moving into a much more into a time where there's much more acknowledgement of each other existence, and different yet equally modern approaches to living the Buddhist Dharma in our contemporary times. And I'm closing my talk for today. Here's one more picture. Many of the pictures I made today, showed today, But doing my research, that's of course a picture of when I presented my research to a Venerable Master at Dajia Temple in Yixing. And that's my last picture I want to give you before I close. Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. Thanks again, Professor Chen, for inviting me.
Thank
and
you.
I'm looking forward to
Yeah.
our question. To the question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Rank. Today's talk gave us an insight into the work of the Fo San in promoting the Dharma around the world. So the contribution of spreading Buddhism on all 5 continents is very, very significant. So especially in the case of humanistic Buddhism, it stands on the foundation of Chinese Buddhism, I think. So while we are spreading Chinese Buddhism today, we are also spreading humanistic Buddhism to the world. I think that is in the 21st century, Chinese Buddhism will become a significant knowledge and wisdom that we are all aspire to and pursue together in the future, because it is very important, I think, in the development of the Buddhism, and has a pivotal position, like Professor Rake just said. And of course, this is also what contemporary scholars have gradually learned through their research, and the larger number of Chinese canoes left behind allow us to sort out many important ideas from the documents. Okay, now we move on the Q&A section. If audience have questions, you can write down your question on the link page, if you have any. And you can also raise your question in Chinese. Professor Ray can speak Putonghua very well. Therefore, maybe he can answer your question in Mandarin later. OK， 所以我们的工作同仁对把那个题目秀出来。OK， 你们也可以用中文写你们的问题。我们黄教授呢，这个 Professor Rank 他的中文名字叫黄隐诗黄隐诗黄教授。那所以各位，如果你要用中文也是可以的。那黄教授他的普通话是非常好的那大家待会互动的话也可以更加的精彩可以更加的脑力激荡。所以我们现在来看第一个题目，那我们就把这个时间再 pass to Professor Ranks. Please answer the question on the board, on the chatboard.
Thank you, Professor Chan. And 谢谢您讲的太好听，我的中文其实已经退步了。So I will just start with the first question. Thank you for your interesting presentation. So the languages, of course, plays an important role, right? And that's also something I did mention in passing in my talk, that most language spaces are Mandarin language spaces. And of course, that has its advantages and its disadvantages, right? It really helps to spread, because it creates this kind of connection back to the culture of origin, and really allows people who may be here, and especially, maybe in the US, and, want to speak the language of origin, go back to the temple and speak Mandarin. But of course, it does also create obstacles, right? Especially for the second generation. There is language courses for them, but many of the second and later generations, they may speak Mandarin well, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable to speak Mandarin. And I think that is something that is an important aspect to really work on not just English. English is, of course, the most well-developed language for Formosan, is the global language, but also, I'm from Germany, I'm from a country not as big and important as the US, but if you look, there's so many European languages to translate and to and if you want to engage with the local populace, you also, of course, have to engage with the local languages. And languages are, of course, not only characters and words, they are attached to culture, right? It's not just about understanding what people say, it's really also relating to the culture of the second generation, of the later generations, and of non-ethnic Chinese. And I think that is something that for the future is really very important to, if you want to preserve or just make the, not just preserve, just make the wisdom of Chinese Buddhism or humanistic Buddhism more accessible, right? Because as of now, despite Chinese Buddhism being numerically one of the biggest Buddhist traditions in the world, it's somewhat unknown outside of Chinese language spaces, right? I mean, Vajrayana, Thai Buddhism, Zen is extremely popular, but Chinese Mahāyāna is still relatively unpopular, and to make it more accessible in the future, I think it's very important to really also pay attention to language and the cultures attached, of course, to language. So I hope that answered the question. So
Okay,
then,
thank you. The second one in Chinese. 请问老师，你觉得未来佛光山在美国的发展会如何？
so this is, I mean, I'm not sure should I speak English or Chinese?
It's up to you.
I started, okay, we're using maybe this one in Chinese, then go back to English. So 这个问题其实跟刚刚的问题其实是有关系的，因为如果我们要在美国发展的话，当然是现在的信徒很多是已经到一个年纪嘛，已经要退休的。是如果要跟特别是第二代、跟第三代、第四代，但是也是跟非华人，要有好关系，让他们了解人间佛教，当然是一定需要 focus 在那个语言的部分。但是我还是觉得我还是蛮乐观，所以我们其实在看，其实除了特别是在这种，我们现在在那个洛杉矶，不只是有华人，然后也是有越南人，有日本人，有很多从亚洲来的佛教团体。然后过去的时候，他们都是好像是不太会合作，但是因为最近2年发现一些越来越，就因为疫情的关系嘛，有一些社会上有一些对亚洲美国的亚洲人有发生一些歧视等等，这个当然是很不好。但是换一个角度来看，我们从这个时间开始，我们有开始西来是很多别的这里的佛教团体会越来越多合作，然后这个当然是一个很重要的一个发展，因为我们真的需要，如果大家都只有做自己的，我们在美国没有什么 voice 嘛，没有什么影响，但是大家都合作，其实这里我们在 San Gabriel Valley 比如说，佛教徒其实是一个很重要的一个 force， 一个社会的一个 force， 所以我觉得虽然当然我们还是要面对一些问题嘛，老化等等，这个是全社会都会面对的一些问题嘛，我还是蛮乐观。So I hope that was yeah, let's maybe go to the next one, because the question later is basically relating to what I just said in English, but let's just to education first. Well, I think, of course, education is, obviously I'm a professor, so I'm biased. Education is very important. And it's not just in the sense of, for a big contribution of Fo Guangshan is, of course, founding schools, but of course, it is also to be present in research, right? I think it is really important that Buddhist groups are not just researched by secular universities, but that Buddhist groups are themselves providing, are engaged in research on Buddhism, which is something that, of course, happens in Asia on a bigger scale, but also in the West, right? That is something we're trying to do here with our institute, that we're creating like a platform for scholars, inviting scholars, not just in humanistic Buddhism, but in a broader sense on Chinese Buddhism or on other Buddhist traditions, but mainly on Chinese Buddhism, and really show that Fo Guangshan contributes to that academic discussions. That is something that is really, in my eyes, really, really important. That is something I'm trying to do here with my institute. And of course, Professor Chen also and the other institutes are equally engaged in this kind of work. Okay, the next. So Fo Guangshan is, of course, interacted. I mean, I will just pick one example. It's somewhat related to the example I was just speaking about in Chinese. So because of this like really unfortunate rise on anti-Asian violence here, we could see an increase cooperation between Asian Buddhist groups here. And that is something that I think is very, very important to really create an impact in society, especially in a majority Christian society where Buddhists are often overlooked, right? But of course, many amongst our devotees, we are, if you count everyone together, it's a very important social force, an important part of society. And of course, it's therefore important to also cooperate with other traditions. And Fogwanshan Chilai Temple has many good relationships, especially with the Theravada community here. Not just here at the schools. I mean, there's the Theravada community has donated a Bodhi tree to Chilai Temple, to campus. We also had last year, 2 years ago, we had a planting ceremony of the Bodhi tree. It was organized by our graduate students here, but we had, of course, our Venerable Abbot here. We had several representatives from the Theravada, especially Sri Lankan tradition, who donated a sapling from the original Bodhi tree. And of course, we did, with our students, we did chanting. So we did chanting of all traditions, so the Vajrayana, the Theravada, the Mahāyāna, all chantings, the Chinese Mahāyāna, Vietnamese Mahāyāna, were all represented. And of course, that is something that happens. But of course, there's always different spaces of different forms. Of course, in the realm of a university, there's more interaction naturally than in the temple space. But on important dates, for example, now as Master Xingyin's enter in Parinirvana. Of course, there were also many representatives of other Buddhist groups coming to the temple and showing their respect. So, and I'm positive that for the future that these kinds of cooperations are only going to be enhanced because they're very important in a diasporic context. And they take place, for example, let me give the South African example. They're taking place on an even higher degree. I mean, South Africa is, of course, the Buddhist community is tiny, is much smaller. So just to make sure Buddhist interests are heard, there's much more interaction between also groups like Tzu Chi, Fogwanshan, but also other Buddhist groups. And that is, of course, important, especially if we are in a position of a minority group, to make sure our voices are heard in those countries. So the next question. Well, that's also a very interesting question. We know that Chinese Buddhism has spread to both North America and Europe. After Buddhism has reached this area, will it integrate with local religions? So it does, of course, to different degrees. Of course, as I just mentioned, I think there's two main frameworks for interaction. One framework is, of course, interreligious dialogue, also something Fogwanshan is highly invested in, which is something that happens on a high institutional level, right? Therefore, you need representatives of a clerical institution or monastic institution. And we just had one or several talks here. We had a Common Ground Week last week on campus, so we had some interreligious dialogue. But of course, Fogwanshan is also Master Xingyin went to the Vatican in the past. So there happens all kinds of dialogue, but that's also, of course, more on the elite level. On the ground level, what is, of course, important is meditation, because meditation is in the West perceived as the Buddhist practice per se, and we see that there is some cooperation, especially now I'm not as familiar with this situation of America, but in Europe, many Christian churches do engage in meditative practices now. There's Qigong, and so we do see some kind of mixing. But of course, something that is also really important to consider here is that not everybody in these countries, especially in Europe, is religious, right? Many people are not, they're not associated with institutionalized religion. So there has to be also a dialogue between religious institutions and the secular world, or the non-religious world, or the spiritual world. So if we want to have a broader conversation, and I think we are in a it's different from country to country, but we are in, of course, highly globalized world, and there is going to be we are seeing increased exchange, but we are still, as Chinese Buddhists, still at the beginning compared to Zen or Vajrayana or Thai or Theravada Buddhism. So the last. So regarding the dissemination of Buddhism, is there currently a combination of Catholicism and Buddhism in the United States? So of course there's always been, I mean, Catholicism and Buddhism have one thing in common very much, right? They both have monastics. And that is something that really allows, that allows to relate, right? So we have, of course, Thomas Merton, very famous Catholic monk from the US, who was always engaged in inter-Buddhist dialogue. I also know from my, from my time, it's not in the United States, but in Germany, I know of Catholic monasteries where monastics engage with Buddhist teachings on inter-Buddhist exchange and meditation. And of course, we see these interactions here too. We also, of course, I mean, the San Gabriel Valley is not only an ethnic Chinese space, it's also a very big Latinx space, right? We see also many people of a Latin background who are, of course, originally Catholic, coming to Shilai Temple and or engaging in other Buddhist groups and meditation groups. So of course we do see these combinations, but LA is not the US, right? It's a completely different picture if you go to the Midwest or the South. So it is, of course, as of now, still a relatively small scale. But in general, Buddhism is, of course, a religion that is very popular, but it has a very good image in the media. So people might not identify as Buddhists, but they're interested to learn about Buddhism. They're interested in going to a temple. They're interested in learning about, monastics and meditation. So we do see there is some interaction going, combination may be going a little far, but there is some interaction that we can see on the ground. So what sort of globalization, that's a bigger question, will come out of the wave of Mahāyāna Buddhist globalization? So obviously, I don't know about the future. However, the point I tried to make in my book was, there is this common idea about globalization is, basically making the world is made by companies like McDonald's and making the whole world looking like westernized and looking like McDonald's. And what I argue is that that's not the case. There might be dominant models of globalization, but there's many, many actors who are involved in building a globalized world. And Foguang Shan is one of those actors, right? So we have globalization taking place from many parts of the world, and not just from Europe and America. And in fact, we are, of course, at a time where one could say that 500 years of a Western-dominated globalization or the colonial model is ending, and we're moving into a multi-centered, multipolar world. So, of course, so that's why I would argue, so I don't know what kind of globalization the result will be, but what I'm arguing is it's definitely going to be a very complex form of globalization, where we can see different trends happening at the same time. But we will, of course, see a continuation. It is definitely an interesting question to see how Mahāyāna Buddhism is going to globalize in the future, right? What is the future of Foguang Shan? What is other groups? Of course, there's also many smaller groups, there's Tiantai temple networks, but we are at the point of a big generational change, right? There is a new generation, and there's a generation that had huge contributions, and now we are seeing what's coming next. So right now, the future is open. It's, I think, a very, very interesting time to see. And as I said before, I think language and dialogue will play a major role, right? We really have to try to be in communication with others, with Catholics, but also with with secular groups to make Mahāyāna Buddhism be heard. Because of course the models that were extremely successful in the 1980s and 90s will not be as successful today, because the situation has changed, right? So the society has changed, the migration waves have changed. So we have to adapt, but Buddhism was historically always able to adapt and at the same time being appreciative of its own tradition. So also I'm still very optimistic in this regard. So Sydney, Chandler's book is, of course, the first English language book on Mahāyāna. It's a very important seminal book. It's somewhat different than my book, because that was also, his book really focused much more of the very important role of Venerable Master Xing Yun, while I was really looking at the overseas situation. Sydney is indeed an interesting case, which I'm afraid I can't really say a lot about. I mean, of course, I'm working closely with our sister institution in Sydney under Venerable Joey, right? We're having actually a meeting. We're having a meeting in 1 hour there. So, but from what I know from a distance, I see the situation in Sydney somewhat similar. And again, my perspective is really limited. I've never been to Australia. Just based on discussion, is somewhat similar to the situation in the US. All right, we have a very strong and highly developed ethnic Chinese diaspora. A very strong, good resources. So it's also a highly developed place. Of course, very similar really to the situation here at the West Coast. So, but I can't really go into detail because I don't know enough about Australia. But I'm eager to learn, as one of my dreams at some point to be able to go to Australia.
Our question is finished. Okay.
We also almost reached time, so maybe that's a
Okay.
sign.
Okay, we still have 7 minutes left. A lot of people concerned about localization. I think the spread of humanistic Buddhism in the world should be focused on the regional and localization issues, right? So the process of the localization cannot be achieved overnight. Right? Please don't be childish or too naive. Localization needs to involve a wide range of aspects. To achieve complete localization of Buddhism, one must face contact and integrations at all levels. So I think this is very important to show our respect to each other. If we fail to achieve this kind of mutual exchange in spirit and mind, the process of localization has not yet succeeded. And so, of course, this process cannot be achieved unless it takes tens or hundreds of years. So, Venerable Master Xing Yun has this to say about the contemporary spread of humanistic Buddhism to other countries. He said that what is localization? Localization is dedication and friendship, right? So in which we develop our own characteristic according to the difference in the culture and the thought, geography, and the custom of each country. So I think this is a very good explanation about the localizations. So Master Xing Yun emphasized the positive thinking of the localizations, and his approach is not to take or remove, even erase, but to give. In Chinese 就是说，我们要去本土化的话，不是去而是要去给。好像大师讲的是给，不是要去把人家拿走，甚至把人家去除掉、erase 掉、remove 掉。But to give, 去给 which is an interactive and integrated way of transmission. 我想这才是最高明的一种落实本土化的一种正向思维啦。那今天呢we are very grateful to Professor Rank. Today's talk is very inspiring. I wonder if Professor Rank still have more valuable comments or ideas that you would like to share with the audience, or some questions that you would like to add, will you?
Well, I have one more point on localization. one important resource for Shan or we have here that sometimes is overlooked is really the second generation, like the children of those who go to the temple. So I think it's very important because they know both cultures, right? And some of them, and of course we see the numbers, don't want to come to the temple, but it's important for us to ask them why, right? Because they really understand the American culture and the Taiwanese culture or Chinese culture or Singaporean culture. They are the ones who have a really, really important source of wisdom that we can learn from. And we see them also here in America now. I mean, Chen Xinghan is an important writer. So they're taking part in the overall discussion on the development of Buddhism in the US and the US. So I think we already have the resources. We just have to listen to them. And of course, it needs, as Professor Chen says, these kind of things need time, right? It's not a one, you know, it takes generations sometimes, right? And it takes lots of being open and lots of conversations and living together, being together. That's
okay. Of course. And another important thing is the issue of language. I think is very important in the propagations of Dharma, because it's the main mediums of the propagations. And in the West to the Westerners, it is necessary to use their language. Therefore, people with English language ability will be of a great help to the propagation of the Dharma. So we need such talent in Buddhism, and we need to cultivate more of such talent, just like our Professor Rank. You can conduct two bilingual Chinese, English, even Germany. Okay, so I think the time about the time limit. So we would like to thanks to Professor Rank. As you mentioned, I was an oral examiner for your master's thesis at the National Zhenzi University in Taiwan. So this event almost 10 years ago, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So in retrospect, time and tide with no matters, and we are really passing through the years, and soon the mission will be passed on from generation to generation, just like you said. So I hope this is the seed of Chinese Buddhism that will be passed on from generation to generation, and will flourish it and bring happiness and prosperity to mankind. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much.
We would like to thank all of the audience who attended the event. That's all today's public talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and thank you to Professor James Green for sharing his book. Before we conclude, I would like to invite you to our upcoming lectures in remembrance of Master Xingyun series, the seventh lecture title, Progression Dharma in Foreign, the North American Transmission of Chinese Buddhism in the 12th century countries, would be presented by Professor Rong Dao from the Faculty of the Religious Studies in McGill University, Canada. The lecture will be take place on the Monday, the 1st of May, from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Hong Kong time via Zoom. It would be in Chinese, and audience can be also participate in the webinar. Thank you for your joining us today, and wish you have a good day. Thank you.